So like I said, you don't need to use PGs all the time, but I don't know, I think PGs are like a fun thing to do, and also it would be a really cool visual to have of your PGs, and that would be like the perfect thing to have, like, because you're supposed to have like 15 pictures, and I mean, we don't have that many pictures right now. Of course we can take pictures during the performance and stuff like that, but if you have like 5 psychological gestures, that's like really good supporting stuff that you can talk about, and you can talk about how they affected you, or you can talk about, like, you can maybe sketch out polarities to have visuals with, like, that would also be something that you could talk about.
What do you mean by, like, polarities?
Okay, it's just like differences in character, like the tempo thing, but it can also be for emotions or psychological attitudes towards things. Like maybe you'll go from one polarity of being extremely sure at the beginning that he did molest the boy, then at the end being like, I don't even know if he did. I have no idea. Like being like going from completely sure without evidence to being doubtful completely. Like those are 2 polarities. Or you could be at the start of the play, you could be mentally sane and then slowly delve into insanity. You know, like like polarities. Or you know, you can crescendo too, because at the end, I mean, it's almost like a calm after the storm, because you confess that you had doubts the whole time, but you had that scene with Father Flynn right before that, where you guys are like that is like, for me in my reading of Doubt, that's like the moment of conflict, the moment where everything is on the table, whereas everything else has been kind of like subtle, behind the back kind of dealings. And that's another thing that I think we definitely need to think about in our performance. Like, we need to think about when we're being subtle, how we can make it subtle for Father Flynn, but for the audience something that is tangible, because the subtleties that we get when we read won't necessarily come out unless we stress them, even if it's just psychologically. If you're thinking, you're like, okay, this line is really important to Aloysius, like saying, like, you're writing with a ballpoint pen. You know, like, that is not in itself something that should be like, you're writing with a ballpoint pen, but it's like, the audience should get the feeling that, like, that is a really, really bad thing. You know, like, you can't express it, but that's interaction. That's something you have to hide, but that when everyone's looking at your face, they can just tell, they're like, oh, God. He's writing with a ballpoint pen, he's a monkey. So, like... he's a what? A what? A monkey. Okay. So, I'll just, like, show you a couple of these. And another thing, like, I was just experimenting with some Sister James PGs. And I don't know if you'll run into this, but I had a very difficult time moving a nun too much. Like, I felt like the nun couldn't be, like in a psychological gesture, then I just had to, like, separate the gesture from my physicality. Which I think is something, like, you might have to do. Another thing, this is cool. So you know when we talk about leading with things?
Yes.
That's Chekhov.
Yay!
He talks about, like, a very inquisitive person would lead with their nose. So, like, it's just like picking out something like that, but that's really beside the point. Like, practical application of your psychological gestures. You can use them in, like, 5 different aspects of your performance. Like, you can have a PG for your entire character. Like, I will have the basic, without the events that have occurred, this is the essence of Aloysius in a psychological gesture. And then also you can do, like, separate moments. So you can psychological gesture for when you're talking to Sister James and trying to, like, get her to give you information. Or you can do per scene. And another thing to remember is that, like, a psychological gesture doesn't always have to be stagnant. Like, you can move in your gesture. So if your gesture if its movement is the movement of the scene, for example, the movement of your level of doubt from the beginning of your scene with Father Flynn to the end of it, then you could do that with a gesture. So you could have, like, a starting position where you feel very sure of yourself, and then moving to something where you feel very weak, or, like, we were talking briefly about atmospheres. And atmospheres are a tricky thing, because For PGs, for atmospheres, you almost have to separate it from your character. And I find it like really difficult to do, but I'm thinking maybe when we're rehearsing, we might do a group psychological gesture and how all the three of us would gesture together, almost to create. More difficult to have internal movements in like group PGs. You're limited to words and group feelings, and you can't be sure that the entire group is feeling the same thing, but you can be, like, you can do symbolic kinds of things. A specific line. Then you might want to have something that you can, like, reach for, because in something like that you have to, like, it has to be really important, like it's really important to your character and you know that, but you're like, I don't know how I can reach that. You might want to have a gesture for that moment. If you're thinking of your psychological gesture and that emotion as you say your line, it'll become less of a, oh, I have such doubts, you know, and it'll become more like thinking about that feeling in your stomach and just spitting the words out with that. And it'll become like a different kind of realism than, oh, I have such doubts. You know, like not showing enough emotion versus like, oh. So
I would like to give some guiding principles, guiding ideas, which will enable them to comprehend our method better. The first principle I am going to talk about, or rather to mention to you, is that our way of developing our bodies is the way to develop it from inside, by means of our psychology, the psychological side more than the physical. We want to fill, to permeate our bodies with psychological values. Therefore, while doing all our bodily exercises, it is good to have in mind this side of the exercise, whatever it might be. Every one of us who wants to use these bodily exercises will never be led astray. He will always know what is the gist, the essence of every exercise, which eagerly absorbs all what is given to it in a form of psychological value.